My lecture today is a follow-up on my research where I have demonstrated that there is absolutely no correlation between IT spending and profitability or productivity. So the question then is, what's the magic reason why you would want to spend money on IT? And the answer is structural. You have to learn about the structure of organizations to see whether they're effective or not. Once in a while, when I despair about progress, I go to my living room and pick up this stone. I obtained this thing from Professor Leakey, the famous anthropologist. This is about 450,000 years old, plus minus 50,000, from Kenya. This is perhaps the oldest artifact created by a human being. And the question then is, how did we get humanity from this to what you are learning every day? And the answer to that is organization. The whole evolution of mankind is one of increasing level of ordering relationship and creating complexity. And in fact, when you look at physics, the theory of thermodynamics tells you that entropy, namely a lack of organization, is the nature of the universe, and that organization will dissipate and disintegrate unless organized. The same theory, in fact, of entropy and application of the laws of physics were applied by Claude Shannon to the fundamental principle of information theory. And that is really the issue today of what information management is all about. How do you measure the degree to which information technology has organized a corporate body or a society? And that means that you have to really apply what physicists use to measure entropy, namely to measure the randomness in the system, measure the loss of information in a message, which is really the Claude Shannon theorem, and of course looking at deterioration in performance, which invariably happened. All organizations deteriorate. Now, whether it is the Egyptian Empire, the Roman Empire, the Soviet Empire, and so forth, these are all aggregations trying to create an aggregation of organization, and without proper care and allocation of resources, they disintegrate it. So what I would like to now do today is to present you with a new theorem of what IT is all about. IT is really how you organize groups of people, nations, societies. And so the polarity between IT, whether it's effective or not, is really the difference between disorder and integration. Now, that is very loosely, it's a generality that really doesn't tell you very much about the techniques that you have to use to deal with the subject of organization. When you look at any body of a corporation or a government agency or a university, you find that the organization is always full of conflicts. There are conflicting trends, goals, strategy, requirements, change in scope, processes, standards, security, et cetera, a long list that consultants make a good living on and professors write books about. So the question then is not about these individual things that you may be learning. The question is, how is it put together? And most importantly, how do you measure it? Because if you cannot measure it, as Lord Kelvin said, you don't know what you're talking about. So what I will be doing today is I'm going to present you some new metrics of organization or disorganization. Now the problem with that is that these kind of data is very hard to come by. Luckily, for the last 2 years, the Office of Management and Budget has forced on various government agencies to submit so-called Form 300, which is in the public domain. You could look at it. And for the Department of Defense, which I have some knowledge of, they have listed 4,121 projects, which means you have now a proxy for organization in the mirror that is cast by 4,121 projects. By the way, the budget for next year is $30.1 billion. And it accounts for 19.5% of the compensation for both civilian and service employees. So we are talking about a significant indicator. And so what I'm going to do now, what anthropologists have always done, is when you want to judge what happened to a primitive society, you look at the pebbles, or the pottery, or the burial customs, or the weapons, or whatever. I will be using metrics which relate to information disorganization. And my case that I'll be presenting today will deal with the organization and disorganization of the Department of Defense. Specifically, what does the $30.1 billion tell you about the degree to which information technology does impact the structure, the cohesiveness of that body? Okay, so far? Everybody okay? Does anybody want to interrupt before I really plunge now into the nitty-gritty, the details? Would rather somebody do something else? It's a beautiful day outside. Well, if you want to do some heavy lifting, so here we go. When you look at the taxonomy that the Office of Management and Budget provided, and they, for each project, for each of the 4,121 projects, they have a long line, including budgets for 01, 02, 03, 04, 05, 06, 07, so you have a time series. And then for each of those line items, you have approximately 32 qualifiers. Who is spending it, how they are spending, what is the function, et cetera, et cetera. What I have done is I have taken the budget category, which describes what I consider the most simplified description of entropy that can be understood by anybody. And I learned it from the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps views everybody in terms of, are you teeth or are you tail? So the teeth to tail ratio is really an expression, a mathematical expression of Shannon theory. And of course, the purpose of a defense organization is to have teeth, and then once in a while go and bite. But you must have teeth. So the first question you can ask by using classification that were submitted to OMB, I will not comment now on the bias, how people record this thing. I'm just saying on face value. 585 projects out of 4,121 were classified as teeth, or supporting the warfighter. In other words, $7.6 billion, 25.4% of the budget is teeth. So by subtraction, of course, that tells you that 74.6 is tail. Now the interesting thing then is, all right, is this a good ratio? And I also have a huge database from the corporate world, and a company that would have a low teeth to toe ratio would actually go bankrupt. Because what you're basically seeing in these numbers is that for every dollar's worth of teeth, there is $3.50 worth of tail. So this is a Brontosaurus, you know, or Tyrannosaurus, a head with lots of teeth, but this big body, you know, which is vulnerable. 51% of the total money in the budget, or 1,891 project, is spent on infrastructure. This is an unbelievable number And the reason why this is unbelievable is because excessive infrastructure costs are clearly an indicator of chaos. And the reason is there is no way to talk about data-centric and network-centric operations if there is 1,891 fiefdoms all protecting their little budget and their little consulting contracts through which you have to thread your communications. So clearly, any ratio of infrastructure that is in excess of 20%, and by the way, that number is declining because when you look at internet, the internet infrastructure, which is infinitely scalable, is incredibly cheap. My estimate is the internet infrastructure costs maybe 2 to 3% of total spending, if that much. Okay? So, and I will discuss why this is so. The rest of the money is spent on finance and accounting, $643 million worth of bean counting. The HR people spend an incredible $2.2 billion. And then you have $1.4 billion allocated to planning and budgeting, which is sort of glorious finance anyway. It's number shuffling. So all I want you to know is that when you look at the structure of DoD, and by the way, this analysis can be applied to any other department. Homeland Security would be a good homework assignment. The same Form 300 is available. And so you can really dish that out as a term paper. People actually may get jobs from that with consultants, of course, well-paying jobs. Now, so far, what I have given you is, in fact, the best case. The reason it's the best case is that although infrastructure has been identified as 51% of the cost, when you look inside, let's say finance and accounting, over $500 million, they have their own infrastructures as well. So what shows up as infrastructure, in fact, is only part of the infrastructure costs. But that is not all. When you look at the fact that the Form 300 only includes what is declared as IT, which is $30.1 billion, there is an additional approximately $160 billion of stuff that is embedded in weapons, and that is avionics, that is part of command and control, which is embedded in the combat information centers. So they all have their own infrastructures. And so there is a whole hunk out there. Nobody has been able to estimate how much IT there is in there. The last estimate I received was from an Assistant Secretary of Command and Control, the Assistant Secretary CIO of Department of Defense, who said, Strassmann, when you see a dollar spent reported on Form 300, it's like cockroaches. You go to the basement and you see 3 cockroaches. There's more than 3 cockroaches in the basement. Now, the question is, how do you estimate, what is the sampling technique for estimating IT money, which doesn't show up on the Form 300? I don't know. The best estimate is that at least it equals the $30 billion. So we are talking about a $60 to $90 billion cost for information technology to support a $400 billion the budget of the Department of Defense. Clearly, that's where the jobs are, and you're studying in the right subject. And there's lots of scholarships and mortgages to be supported from that kind of money. What is intriguing, however, is that The tooth-to-tail ratio does vary from service. The highest infrastructure cost is the Air Force. Their infrastructure consumes 61% of their budget. The Army has the lowest because the Army has been working this thing longest. Now, structure. Structure is very important. Now that I've given you the aggregate numbers, you have to now look at the qualitative aspects of these numbers, and you say, well, what is the distribution pattern of these infrastructure costs? And you then can draw a histogram. You have software here to do histograms? Okay. Well, you get these unbelievable, interesting left-skewed histograms, which I have in front of me here. The bulk of the projects have a budget of less than $2 million. Now, $2 million in the Department of Defense, if you know anything about the Department of Defense, is what's called maintenance. Okay, you know, just the contracting process takes about half of it. I see somebody knowledgeable here on this subject smiling. Is that correct? Yeah. And half is lucky. It's a good number. So what you see here is a highly skewed distribution. And that is, there are only 30 projects in the entire Department of Defense that are, in my opinion, over the critical math to do any qualitative change. There's only 30 projects like that. So what you see here is a fractionated infrastructure. And the moment when you see money dissipated in little pieces to take care of the local operations of the local fiefdoms, in the local bureaucracies, you will find that you've created a sociological environment that will foster and promote local solutions. So if you have that kind of a left-skewed distribution, the idea to talk about network integration, network-centric communications from the battlefield all the way down to acquisition, and the data-centric environment that everybody talks about, namely that the information available in a ditch outside some godforsaken village somewhere where somebody is calling for support, and you expect that message to come through the various echelons, the fractionization of the infrastructure will absolutely assure that unless you have enormous amount of labor and error correction and supervision, the message will not get through. So now that I have described to you the taxonomy, the structure of the analysis, and there's lots of details, of course, behind it, let me go into the issue of how to solve the problem. Okay. When you look at history, and you know, again and again, when you examine historical events, you will find that the infrastructures get cancerous, and it almost requires either an ability to reform from within, which is very rare, or it requires a grand design and architecture like the US Constitution to put in a sufficiently flexible structure that will allow the evolution to take place through feedback, separation of powers, and so forth. So the question in the information age is, what is the Constitution? What is the algorithm for dealing with a phenomena of growing complexity and growing cumbersome? And the answer is really that the fundamental flaw in the infrastructure lies in one element and one element only, which is data. if you don't get the data right, you will just have to patch and fill and splice and integrate and interface and middleware and all of those other good things you are taught here. So what you will do is, if the data isn't right to begin with, and there is what's called promiscuity in how data gets generated and disseminated and aggregated, you are going to have a phenomena that is going to cause the proliferation of the infrastructure and the overhead costs. Now, that has been recognized. I just want to point out to you that the Department of Defense once upon a time had a deputy secretary who was a nephew of President Taft. In 1964, he issued DoD Directive 5000.12, which basically said we really need standardization of data in this place. Very far-seeing principle. I have a copy of this directive. It's as good today as it was in '64. I wouldn't change a word on it. And of course, it just plunked into the stream of DoD directives and been never heard of after that. When yours truly got into the Department of Defense and did pretty much the kind of analysis that I just described to you, I said, aha, there is an answer. And it's simple. All you have to do, streamline the data, have data definitions, and create a mechanism for creating metadata directions, and then impose that on procurement, and then in due course, the old stuff is going to die and all the new stuff is going to mate, integrate, communicate, cross-check, and be ultimately secure, because you'll be able to tag it by security. And so in 25th of June 1992, a momentous event happened. Now the new Deputy Secretary of Defense, a former Vice Chairman of General Motors, Donald Atwood, published a Directive 5105 that created a standard data element development, approval, and maintenance procedure. And then there are two manuals, each running about 180 pages, outlining how to do it. Frankly, I wouldn't pass anybody in a course of information science and information management without being able to answer a quiz based on questions asked from those manuals. They are splendid. They are outstanding. Now remember, that was in June 1992, which was a good year until the election. And that's a private joke. And we have had recently, in 2004, a partial renewal of this thing, but only in token. The royal amount being spent on data administration, which is, in my view, the nexus, the key to information integration, is 0.64% of the total budget. So the most important thing, which is the core competency of interoperability and warfighting, particularly asymmetric warfighting, is underfunded. Now, what is the penalty for not having a standard data environment? I have lots of numbers on project costs. But what I would like to impart to the students is, when you look at a typical Defense Department project, anywhere from $2 to $20 million, that's how these things are sliced. You'll find that program management and integration takes over 60% of the cost. The hardware is practically trivial, it's throwaway. The hardware cost on a typical project is in a 1 to 2% range. So all of you who are studying with great diligence hardware taxonomy and design and what have you, remember, you're studying more and more, less and less. I'm sure that the faculty here will not be pleased with that, but nevertheless, the realistic view is that the issues are partially in software, which is about 6% of a project cost. The bulk is really in management, which is integration. And of course, that is due to the fact that you have to continually splice. You have to do neurosurgery on a running athlete that is pathetically disabled and maybe catatonic once in a while. So what are then the entropy reversal rules, which I would like to leave with you in the time allowed? You have to go back to the whole idea that what matters ultimately, and I'm oversimplifying, but I think you could take that as a sort of a 70, 80% oversimplification. What matters is infrastructure and data. If you get that right, all the other things are going to be right. Interoperability, costs, reliability, security, and so forth. So the first thing you have to do is you need a dumb, stupid infrastructure. Don't put intelligence into the infrastructure. Don't put functionality. The great intellectual achievement of Internet is basically a dumb system. It has a minimum number of capabilities. But because it's dumb, it means that anybody can play, even if you have a Macintosh. It's a joke. Okay? And the other thing is you have to remove data from applications. Data is totally separate from applications. That logical separation is absolute. Now, we have, of course, decisions that you have to separation of church of state. Jefferson, the whole Constitution of the United States is based on separation of church and state as a fundamental principle of governance. The Strassmann collateral of that thing is separation of data from applications. And that means that if you have that kind of a construct, the low-cost, reliable, interoperable, flexible, adaptable system will migrate intelligence to the periphery for variety and innovation, rather than through standardization on Microsoft desktops. I will not mention certain Navy and Marine Corps projects here as an example of things where, as a way of dealing with the whole question of entropy, intelligence is being standardized as part of the network. That's not the way to do it. Fourth, you must enforce standards. You cannot get into the infrastructure unless you pass through standards. And lastly, you must create an environment where your costs are variable rather than fixed. The thing that drags down and that accumulates costs is the fact that the variable cost is negligible and everything is a fixed cost, which means it's all intractable. In conclusion, then, I would like to leave with you, the student body, a simple definition of what information management is all about. Please write it down. Your mission as information professionals is to reverse entropy. Thank you very much. I'll take questions now. Yes.
Talk a little bit about not building intelligence into the infrastructure, because the trend we're seeing is intelligence in the network as a way of promoting more security.
Oh, well, you are not mentioning Microsoft, for instance. No, you wouldn't mean. Moving intelligence into the network and into the operating system and into the browser is a way of capturing monopoly position. You want me to elaborate on that? the tendency to move intelligence into the network, like security, and then making the browser and the operating system a part of an extended network, is a way of creating defensible marketing positions which are hard to dislocate. SAP is the artist in this thing. You go into the SAP den, you'll never crawl out. Let me just give you an example. The total cost per seat for the Navy and Marine cost project, NMCI, is about $28,000 per seat. And you say, $28,000 per seat, why? We are only buying machines that on a mass quantity from Dell run you less than $1,800. So where is the other, $25,000? And the answer is the thing was glued in and is being glued in into an infrastructure. With the infrastructure, the data, and the applications are welded together, thereby establishing a revenue stream for whoever does that. Did I answer your question?
Well, I think I understand it better with respect to Microsoft SAP than I do with the network itself.
Well, Microsoft will, to the extent possible, and this was part of the antitrust when they wedged the browser, which should be clearly outside of the network. They forced the communication center and the browser right into the operating system as a way of establishing a franchise which can be upgraded and source of revenue. So just, as they say, always follow the money. I mean, if you have a technical question, another gold nugget for you, if you have a technical question that you don't understand, just follow the money. It's amazing what answers you get. Okay, other questions? Yes?
In your tooth-to-tail ratio, if the tail being bigger is a sense of disorder, going towards a continuum of disorder, what would be your optimum for integration? How big would the teeth have to be in ratio to the tail for you to have a well-integrated, well-running, not disorganized operation or corporation?
Excellent question. How do you design a mammal that is going to deal with a dinosaur, right? And the answer is Darwin does it. You go in and reality will tell you which way to go. In other words, if you have to go into combat in Fallujah, you cannot afford too many onlookers out there, okay? So there is no answer to your question. What you have to do, you have to look at specific cases, and then based on those cases, judge whether it makes sense or not. And there's lots of stories I can give you, lots of stories. But basically it means metrics and looking at performance. You have to see what is the performance. Well, let me give you a case. The most active and aggressive competitor today in the Pacific is Singapore. About 5 years ago, a very large US corporation heard that Singapore wants to be the information island of the Pacific. And they published it. We want to be the information island. And they say, well, come on, guys, what can you guys do? So they put together a small delegation. I was a member of the delegation. Go and have a look at the Singaporeans, how they do it. And I spent days and days going, visiting data centers and so forth. Well, there was hardly any tail. It was all teeth. I came back and said, these guys are going to be winners. And we see that already. The Singaporeans are teaching the Chinese much of the success that exists today in China rapidly growing and taking over markets, politically and otherwise, is due to the fact that they are basically replicating small Singapores, franchises, on mainland. So, to answer your question, which is a very good question, and again, this goes to the faculty, you ought to study patterns of success and patterns of failure. And you have to see how Walmart ate up Kmart. And really, don't listen to the glossy stuff, you know, the Fortune magazine stuff. You actually go and look at the numbers. It's absolutely amazing how this little predator from Arkansas, you know, out of the boonies, Bentonville, Arkansas, never ever heard of those guys, ate up everybody. How did they do it? Study it. Okay? Yes, sir.
The differences between the teeth and the tail. Do you ever find it difficult to classify a project as either teeth or tail, or is there ever any overlap in a project?
Oh yeah, and the tendency will always be when you sell a project, particularly congressional committees, you will just say, well, you know, this is going to do blah, 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 you know, for the Marines and so forth. And so now you really have to do then a reality test. You have to look at the application and see how much of this application will get below the battalion level. I usually, you look at these mega projects and then they say, okay, now show me where are the installation, what are the application, who's going to use them. I was horrified when I showed up in the Department of Defense that the soldiers got nothing. When I got into Xerox, the whole company depended on its maintenance people, who maintained a machine that kept failing and burning up and all of that thing. You know, this was in the 60s. And I say, well, all right, how much money are you spending per capita? This is a very good metric, by the way, IT spending per capita. How much are you spending for the service people in the field? The answer was $32 per capita per year. Okay. Basically, they were printing punch cards that they gave them out that they had to fill out. Then I asked, well, how much are you spending for financial analysts? Well, we cannot tell you. So I said, well, okay, it's, you know, I'm running a thing, so I put a meter on this thing. The financial analysts were spending more money on IT than their salaries. They were using APL, which in those days was very fashionable, and they could burn up money. So you really have to look at structure. And the purpose of my message today is don't just look at spending, don't look at technology, start looking at structure as a property of an information society. Did I answer your question?
I would offer the thought to go with that. Paul says, whatever you're examining, it's the teeth is the essence of what that is about. The essence.
Yeah.
Air Force, although it doesn't like to admit it, his job is to haul, to drop food on people. And when you examine the essence, then you can use theories as well.
Yeah, how much of that goes into targeting? That's teeth, okay? And then you say, well, all right, you guys are spending $8.5 billion. How much of that goes for doing what you're supposed to do? And you get a number, and it's an interesting number. Okay, any questions from the students? I prefer to have student questions. Yes? Are you a student?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
We had a couple of discussions in class based on your books and everything on outsourcing.
Outsourcing.
And trying to see if you're outsourcing, the real reality is that you're outsourcing, you're saving money. But in all reality, you're not. I just wanted to see if you can actually talk about that a little. And how are you not saving money where actually you're sending a job and you're getting it cheaper, but in reality, you're spending the same money or you're budgeting it the same?
Okay. If you outsource something that's faulty, you're not going to get any better, even if you get it cheaper. You understand that? So outsourcing is not a solution. By the way, you can come to my webpage, just published an article. I've studied the outsourcing ratio for 1,100 companies. It's on my webpage, strassmann.com. And I showed that companies that don't outsource too much are actually more profitable than companies that are very heavy outsourcers. The current decline by General Motors, which is a national disgrace, is largely the result of the hollowing and divestment of General Motors of its fundamental skills. Now, there's a time for outsource. I have always outsourced. But you have to be, again, it's a structural issue. You have to pick what you outsource, and you have to be very careful that you are outsourcing not just to cut costs, because there's always somebody who can do things cheaper. But that is not the way to prosperity. The way to prosperity is to get more teeth and sharper teeth. So the question you should ask, not do I get cheaper toothpicks or cheaper toothpaste, but do I have a greater capability? Did I answer your question? Are you an outsourcer or anything like that? No, okay, all right. Okay, any? Yes. You're a student?
Yes, I am.
Okay, okay.
For commercial business, because you're talking about the DoD, and the DoD doesn't measure itself by what Wall Street, it doesn't do EBITDA, OIBDA, or any of that type of that structure. So when you're saying that for a company to look at its structure and its disorder to find out whether or not it's strong, pretty much, and integrated, will that reflect, if they focus on that rather than on the numbers that Wall Street wants to know, will your theory manifest itself and make Wall Street happy, because that's pretty much how a corporation defines itself?
Wow, you really have heavy ammo. Let's go over Wall Street first, because you can always beat that. The problem with Wall Street is that they by and large measure ROE and ROA. Now think about it. ROE or ROA is a ratio of profits divided by capital on the balance sheet, right? The question is the capital that FASB, your sometimes honest accountants account for, is that a measure of a company? And the answer is no, because the value of the company is not shown on the accounting statement. The bulk of the measure of a company is in its knowledge capital, which doesn't show up in any of the financial statement. Okay, so far so good? Okay, so that takes care of Wall Street. Okay, now let's go get constructive. How do you evaluate a company which includes what really matters, which is knowledge capital? What you have to do, you have to start using a different approach to economics. And that is the factor of production used to be land, labor, capital, okay? And human beings never showed up. What economics test do you have? Samuelson? Samuelson never figured out the human capital, okay? So what you have to do then, you have to say what matters in the information age is knowledge capital. Now, how do you calculate knowledge capital? It turns out that the knowledge capital is the true residual profit after you treat capital as a commodity. Let me repeat that. There is a technique for doing that called EVA, economic value added. In economic value added, the accounting profit statement is not the profit of a company. The economic value of a company is profit minus rent for shareholder capital. And then if you have something left over, that is the contribution of knowledge. I have about 20 articles on this. Do you guys teach about knowledge capital here? What? We use your books. No. That book doesn't have that. That's for a graduate That's for graduates. I have quite a bit. I have actually a 150-page ebook on knowledge capital and how you do the calculation, and you're welcome to it. So to answer your question, how do you then evaluate a company, now whether it is Department of Defense or whether it is a private corporation or Xerox, doesn't matter. What you do is you look at the residual cost, and that is knowledge capital. Now in the public sector, it's a little tricky, but basically the knowledge capital is the cost of what's called reconstitution. In other words, if you take the 3rd Armored Division after Kuwait and send them home because you're going to save $120 million a year, what you have to understand, fine, that's operating costs, it's O&M, but it's not, you know what O&M is, operations and maintenance. That's O&M, OMB penny pinching. What you have to understand is what is the knowledge capital if you need a 3rd Armored, which we needed again. And the answer is the reconstitution cost of a 3rd Armored is the knowledge capital. What?
That is slick.
Very slick. That's very slick. Okay, I've run out of time. I've run out of knowledge capital. Let me offer the following. All my lectures come with a warranty. I'm a vendor with a warranty. For 90 days, I will take email questions to paul@Strassmann, STRASSMANN.com. I will not do your homework assignments. I may give you homework assignments. And I'll be very pleased that some of this may be of interest to you. Thank you very much.